Hi, everyone. I'm going to read number 43 today, and the topic is tropes and cliches in storytelling, but the context is fantasy, environments, mostly fantasy writing. And I'm going to chat about it a little bit first because there's what I consider the most ubiquitous trope I don't write about in the journal that I'll read soon. So I'm going to talk about it a little bit here. It's the one that I find most obnoxious, which is over the top fight scenes. For pages and pages, right? There's Cirque du Soleil sword play, and punch after punch after like none of it makes any sense, and I just consider the whole thing absurd. Those sorts of fight scenes I encounter so regularly, and they can be done well, almost never, but they can be done well. And there's one instance I have in mind in which it was executed perfectly. It was the writing was beautiful, the control, the sentences themselves, control of language, all this stuff was so good. And that's Rage of Dragons, Evan Winter. Now, I only read the first book. My wife read the first two, and so I can only comment from my own experience about it. But to me, it felt in that book like a fight scene from page one to the end. Whereas just the entire movie is one long fight scene that occasionally people catch their breath and whatever. So it's like the literary fantasy equivalent of a John Wick movie. Throughout, between punches, there's plot and there's backstory, there's character development, there's all the features of good storytelling in there, but it's essentially one huge fight scene, and it was done really well despite being over the top. More spectacular than John Wick. There's like dragons and there's demons and there's magic and there's all this stuff, and then usually for me subtlety is key for believability, and I'll talk about that soon. But there were a couple of things that a couple of cliches. Remember, I'm going to be talking about tropes and cliches here, but there are a couple of very tiny cliches that sort of only rub me the wrong way. I've never heard anybody else have a problem with these utterances, but to me, it just slightly takes me out of it. It's slightly too abrasive. And the first one, and they were sort of prominently featured in Rage of Dragons and tons of things. The first one is, that's what I imagine people doing. It's sucking of one's teeth. And I always find this weird when characters like as a mark of Omehi downtime, you have to like suck your teeth to show that's the verb to indicate that not much is going on, you're contemplative or whatever. Tons of writers do this. Pat Rothfuss, my favorite living fantasy writer, does it. This is something that characters do, and I think it comes from Tolkien early in Fellowship. Sam standing by the pony, sucking his teeth. There's a scene of him, and I thought it was slightly creepy in that instance, and I didn't like it. And then in every subsequent resuscitation of that line in other works, I found it slightly creepier and less pleasant than the original. And then the only other cliche in Rage of Dragons that I don't like is something that in its original form I did like. So it's not like the Tolkien one, which I thought was always bad. This one in Princess Bride, I think everyone's going to know the scene I'm talking about, where Inigo Montoya encounters Tyrone Rugen for the first time in adult vengeful years, right? For the first time since he was a child and whatever his cheeks got happened. And Tyrone sends 4 of these guards, soldiers, over to him. And the fight scene is 1 sentence long. And I think it's the most powerful single sentence of any fight scene ever written. I think it goes something like, the 4th guard was dead before the first one had sufficient time to hit the floor. perfect, right? It's subtle. There's paragraphs worth of action packed into one simple sentence. It was so good. And it seems to be sort of a play on like I was asleep before my head hit the pillow, that line repurposed into fantasy settings. But now everyone just uses it since. I mean, that was 1973, and I thought it should have stayed there and been in sort of canonized in like fantasy museums. That line, but everyone has sort of repurposed that line. It was very abundant in Rage of Dragons. But other than that, I thought the book was so good, and it's very unlike me to like something of that nature because, again, I think subtlety is so necessary for believability, for investment, for all of this for me. And the reason I attribute to this, whether my today's psychology comes from what I think it did, or if it was just, who cares? But what I attribute to this sort of revelation or this position I have is from when I was a little kid. Okay, it's like you open the windows, you look outside, and it's the 1980s, like little Courtney in the neighborhood. It's 1980s sky, 1980s grass, 1980s people, 1980s wrestling is going on. And so my brother and I go across the street to like a house and a half down across the street to the Gonzalez's house and into their basement. This like windowless, dark basement with no overhead light, no like normal lights on. And we watched wrestling in there. The two light sources that were in that basement was this like strobe light fiercely like flashing against the screen, against the TV screen. Just this like powerful flickering against the TV, the most to add tension, to make it uncomfortable, to what we thought of as enhance the experience. And then in the back of the room, there were black lights, like the only other light source that's genuinely unpleasant to look at. And again, that discomfort was adding tension, and tension we thought of as enhancing the experience of watching wrestling. And Luis and my brother and all of us down there are cheering. Okay, I mean, we're yelling ourselves hoarse, and I mean, just like vigorously cheering on our favorite wrestlers, Hulk Hogan and whatever. It's this era. And then a couple of years go by, year or two, I don't know how long, the future happens. And I learn that wrestling, WWF, what it was called at that time, I learned that the outcomes are predetermined, that it's just staged, the whole thing. And I didn't feel like betrayed or hurt or anything. I was just sort of confused because why does anybody cheer for it? It didn't make sense. Like I was sort of duped. And so that's why I was cheering. But why were other people cheering? You watch the thing. It's like this big pay-per-view thing. You watch it and it was like thousands of people yelling louder than any of us were. Why would anybody cheer for anybody in a fixed environment where like the outcome is predetermined? It didn't like imagine it's like a Civil War reenactment. Okay, it's fake combat and the outcome is predetermined and everything is fixed and whatever. In that setting, I've never been, but in that setting, I can't imagine there are people on the sidelines trying to rally the troops, shouting for their favorite general or whatever. Like, you can do it. I don't know, like Ambrose Burnside, or like Yankees, you got this, or like I don't think anybody in that setting would be doing that. So none of this ever really made sense at that point. And I stopped kind of that day. I stopped appreciating, I certainly stopped cheering, but I stopped appreciating wrestling. And what's worse is I began to conflate over-the-top action with phony, bogus, staged, hoaxy settings, right? Where like, okay, wrestling is spectacular and it's fake. all spectacular fighting is comparably fake. That was this association I started to draw. And so whenever something reaches that Cirque du Soleil performance level, it doesn't connect with me because I don't believe it. And it's so common in fantasy that it's hard for me that's like the trope that closes more books prematurely than any other fantasy, trope. But having said that, Evan Winter, that like pay-per-view Royal Rumble was worth the ticket. That one was actually good, but usually I have a hard time connecting with it. Okay, with that said, I'm going to read number 43. All right, 43, Tuesday, February 14th, 2023, Tropes. Hi, everyone. Discussing tropes is a tedious cliche. And I feel like the inverse is nearly true as well, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I'll begin our trope discussion with country music in the 1990s. Garth Brooks, Toby Keith, Travis Tritt, Alan Jackson, etc. I'm not an avid listener, but I've heard plenty of songs, all by accident, which sort of approximates random selection. Assuming my sample is representative of the larger population of songs in this genre, then G major was a staple of the old Chevy S10 airwaves, a trope, in other words. While composing in strict accordance with this trope, many of the denim-clad artists created culture-defining masterpieces. At the same time, other trope-adhering efforts were super corny. The difference was whether G major had a loving home. The same is true with every other medium of storytelling, fantasy, for example. A story about the chosen one who discovers he's the secret heir who was prophesied to confront the Dark Lord can be super corny, or it can be a masterpiece. It depends how it's written, how the story is dressed. If any universal lesson can be credited to CMA culture, it's that well-worn pants remain fashionable. That said, there are some tropish scenes in contemporary fiction that I can't cope with, no matter how masterfully they're done. The standoff, for example. The bad guy is caught and cornered, but he has a hostage, and he's holding a weapon to that hostage's head or throat, and he's demanding that the hero, who loves that otherwise disposable hostage, hand over the MacGuffin or disclose the secret information or whatever. While the hero and baddie are standoffing, the hostage shouts things like, "Don't do it, Zach!" Or "Don't give it to him, Zach!" Or "Don't you say a thing, Zach!" Despite those suicidal pleas, Zach slowly lowers his weapon and surrenders. I have no idea what happens next because I stop watching at that point, because this scene is absurd. It would be more believable if the victim were sobbing and pleading, "Please, Zach, please, tell him everything." But believability aside, if the hostage really did desire that outcome, they would just press the knife into their own throat. Or if it's a gun, they'd wriggle and try to escape, forcing their captor to shoot, or just scream as loudly as they can right into the villain's face, mouth gaping, occasionally gasping for air, then returning to the piercing banshee wail. If execution is the goal, any of those would be more effective than creating a tense emotional impasse and forcing the hero to make the decision. That's the worst thing a hostage can do. Only a true asshole would do that. So I stopped watching. If I lived on a slower spinning planet, I would use some of those extra daylight hours to write a screenplay about a character named Ralph Machismo, whose every action is an unbearable trope. In the opening scene, he'll be swaggering away from a thing that explodes, and he won't look back. He won't even flinch. And then to suspensify the film, I'll add several scenes of a big, thick, important door that's slowly closing, with Dr. Machisimo sprinting toward it. The world as we know it will be toast if he doesn't make it through. He'll make it in time. Onlookers are shrieking, but without a second or centimeter to spare, he does. Of course, I'll ease the tension on occasion with scenes of him post-battle carving an apple with a combat knife and eating the sliced off bits right from the blade until he finally makes it home and I can exhibit Lord Machisimo's culinary sophistication by having him crack some eggs into a frying pan using one hand. The end. Or is it? It is. Here's my conclusion. Even the most well-worn tropes fraying in the knees can be brought to life if the retelling has life in it, excepting explosions, doors, apples, and eggs. Me. Okay, that's it. And may the rest of your day be filled with tropes that bring you satisfaction.